Hello and welcome to this webinar, Engaging the Public and the Road to COP26. My name is Jamie Clarke. I'm the Executive Director here at Climate Outreach. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we're a charitable organisation focused on uniting society in action on climate change. We at Climate Outreach believe people are at the heart of addressing climate change, but that for too long, climate has been a minority issue. So by mobilising social research to support climate advocates, as we are doing today, we hope to play a critical role in the way the public is engaged in key nations around the world. And COP26 is a key moment for doing that. We'll hear today about our insights from the Britain Talks climate research that we have undertaken, and then look at how we can take that research and make it the most usable and accessible for campaigners, advocates and others in the sector. COP26 is a milestone in so many ways for climate policies, but it's also a key public engagement moment. And this presents, I would suggest, two strategic challenges for us as those who care about climate change. The first challenge is turning the high point of public concern we're currently experiencing into tangible political decisions. But the second challenge is how to ensure that this technocratic policy meeting in Glasgow, that can often get bogged down in arguments over commas and the placing of certain semantics, how does that actually build and contribute to public concern and understanding? And it doesn't undermine it as it has in other historical incidences. We know that civil society organisations and climate advocates will have a critical role in addressing both of these challenges. So we hope that this session will help you understand better how to engage different communities in the run-up to the conference, and look at how, in particular, you can translate individual behaviour change and action into something that is motivating alongside system change. A topic that we know a lot of climate advocacy organisations are very interested in. So in this session, you'll hear from my colleague, Dr Susie Wang, who will talk about the Britain Talks climate findings and insights, and Robin Webster, the leader of our Advocacy Communication programmes. And then we'll have a question and answer session. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Susie.
Thanks, Jamie. All right, hi everybody. I'm going to start us off by quickly recapping Britain Talks Climate. So Britain Talks Climate is a project that we launched in November last year with our partners More in Common and the European Climate Foundation. And the purpose of Britain Talks Climate is to equip the sector with tools to reach a broad section of the British public on climate change. It's based on a 10,000 person survey and over 200 hours of interviews, focus groups, as well as several waves of follow-up polls that we did last year. And the basis of this is that we grouped respondents based on their core values and their beliefs, and found 7 distinct segments of Britain that have particular patterns of attitudes. So I will bring them up here. So these are the 7 segments. I'm going to talk through them briefly. So only 2 of the groups really strongly identified with their political views, and these are at the top. Both of them are financially stable, they're politically active, and they're more likely than other segments to have attended tertiary education. In the yellow, progressive activists are among the younger segments, so they trend younger. They tend to vote Labour. This segment also feels angry and pessimistic about the way things are going in the country. And of all of the segments, they feel the least proud to be British. They're a very vocal and political segment about the issues that they care about, and climate change is the primary issue for them. The next segment is the backbone conservatives in this dark blue, and this segment trends older. They also tend to vote conservative. They're very proud to be British, which is the opposite of progressive activists, and of British heritage and history. And while they're not skeptical of climate change, they do have a resistance towards certain kinds of environmental activism. But what's important is that they do care deeply about protecting the environment, about certain aspects of sustainable living, for instance, having good quality local seasonal food, farming, and also preserving the rural landscape. The next 2 segments are going to be the civic pragmatists and the established liberals, and these two, their politics are present, but they're softer. So on the left, we have the civic pragmatists in the pink, who are more moderate than the progressive activists. They're mostly middle income, they have medium levels of education and work in medium social grades. And they are the second most engaged group on climate change after the progressive activists. And actually on some personal measures, whether it's recycling, reducing waste, or buying local food, they are as committed as progressive activists. They're just as likely to do them. But when it comes to political actions like voting, contacting MPs, or signing petitions about climate change, they tend to be much more passive and less engaged. Partly this is potentially due to their sort of low sense of political motivation, political efficacy. So they tend to believe that politicians don't care about people like them. The established liberals, on the other hand, are one of the most empowered groups that we have. They're more likely to work in higher social grades. They're economically stable. So also their beliefs are economically conservative while also being socially liberal. So they're proud of the diversity of the country, and they tend to have a global international sort of view. They're characterized by their sort of sense of feeling safe and comfortable. They have a generally untroubled perspective, and one of the groups that's more open to global cooperation. The next two groups are what we call the disengaged groups, and there are two of them as well, the disengaged battlers and the disengaged traditionalists. And both of these segments tend to be of lower income backgrounds. They are less likely to attend tertiary education and work in lower social grades. They also have in common very low civic and political engagement. So around 30% of both segments tend not to vote in general elections or local elections, and they share the feeling that society has left them behind. While the disengaged battlers, for instance, are younger, they tend to live in more urban areas, and of all segments are the most likely to be unemployed and least likely to feel part of the community. This segment is actually quite, they aspire to environmentalism, they want to be sustainable, and they support climate action, but they feel frustrated by what they see as middle-class environmentalism. They see a lot of the actions that are being asked of them as things that only people with enough money can achieve. So they feel quite frustrated by that. On the other hand, we have the disengaged traditionalists who trend older, they're more right-leaning, more meritocratic and traditional. And despite being among the more financially unstable segments, they don't tend to see themselves that way. They don't see themselves as vulnerable and are generally quite resistant to messages about protecting vulnerable groups. This segment is also somewhat skeptical of climate change, again around 30%, and are the least likely of all segments to do anything personally on climate change. And finally, the loyal nationals in the blue are demographically similar to the disengaged traditionalists in that they tend to be older and right-leaning and traditional, but they're not disengaged at all. They're actually quite politically active. And this is likely because they feel galvanized or threatened by particular issues. And these are things like crime and immigration and also climate change. So of all the segments, they're the third most concerned about climate change, and they want to see radical action. But then their worries are more to do with a sense of localized inequality and environmental decline rather than a sense of global concern. So that was a very quick summary of all the segments. I'm going to move on to talk about what these segments have in common. Many across the segments think that the UK should be one of the most ambitious countries in the world when it comes to climate change. And you can see that the agreement, which is indicated in this red-orange color, is quite high for the majority of segments, the top 5 of the segments there, but it's much more split across the last 2. One thing to note is that disagreement is actually quite low, so disagreement is indicated in the sort of grayish black color. And I think overall around 61%, that's a different stat. Yeah, one thing to note is that for the 2 segments that don't so much agree with the statement, there's high uncertainty. So a lot of people didn't know whether they agreed or disagreed among the disengaged traditionalists and backbone conservatives. So what may matter in this case is how we talk about UK leadership and how to emphasize the UK's role in the world. This is crucial not only to help the more engaged segments talk positively about the summit, but also to prevent negative reactions from those who feel disconnected from it. So as I mentioned before, different segments have varying levels of pride in the UK. So for instance, calling the UK a climate leader may not work well with some segments, either because they don't believe it's the case, so that might be for the progressive activists, for instance, or because they don't think it's something the UK should aspire to, which might capture more of the views of the disengaged traditionalists. And in fact, we found that people's views on international cooperation and multilateralism are mixed as well. So even while they admit that climate change and COVID, these issues don't respect borders, they affect everyone, there's mixed support for whether we should work across borders with other countries on these issues. So in this figure, black indicates agreement with the statement, this crisis shows we need to work more closely with other countries and international institutions, and this crisis refers to COVID. And red corresponds to agreement with we can't rely on support from other countries and international institutions. You can see that the top 4 segments there, from progressive activists to established liberals, have quite high agreement that we need to work more closely, whereas the 3 segments at the bottom there, loyal nationals, disengaged traditionalists, and background conservatives, are much more split on this particular issue. Overall, I think 61% of the population agreed to work more closely with other countries on major issues. But there is a sort of divide there between the more left-leaning groups and the established liberals and the more right-leaning groups. And potentially what might shed light on this is when it comes to sort of leadership action at home, this question that we asked about maintaining self-reliance shows strong support across the board, including the segments that were skeptical of the previous question, indicating that perhaps nobody wants to rely on other countries. And actually these messages of self-reliance of the UK building up its green industries at home can receive cross-societal support. Another issue is potentially how we talk about ideas that even are sort of the more unifying ideas that sort of join different segments. So for instance, fairness is often seen as a unifying value that all segments share. And I think here is an opportunity and also a necessity to unpack exactly what fairness means to the different segments. So for instance, it could mean that everyone needs to play by the same rules, everyone needs to do the same thing to some segments. It might also mean for other people that fairness is climate justice for marginalized and most affected groups. Fairness could also mean a fair and just transition, and it could mean not asking of particular segments impactful lifestyle changes that are not feasible for them when there are other people in other segments that have higher emissions profiles. And finally, it could also mean that there's resistance against the UK increasing its ambition if it's perceived as unfair in the international context. There's sort of the sentiment that if other countries are not doing enough, why should we do more? And on this particular point, it's worth noting that the background conservatives and the loyal nationals are the most likely of all segments to hold foreign governments responsible for climate action. And the loyal nationals in particular are characterized by a sense of insecurity and a perception of threat, particularly against, well, this is a question about immigration, but also the idea that people from other places, other countries are given preferential treatment. Their perception of threat for the loyal nationals might explain their high concern about climate change, but when it comes to the international dimension of climate action, of COP26, this is an area where loyal nationals may feel less engaged. Similarly, messages about helping vulnerable groups may not work well with some. So for instance, this question is about how coronavirus will leave the majority of the population worse off, with vulnerable people the hardest hit. The same will be true of climate change, and taxation needs to be fair, and those with the means should pay more to help those in need. And what we see here is responses from disengaged battlers, loyal nationals, disengaged traditionalists, and background conservatives. And what's notable is that the disengaged battlers and loyal nationals have quite high agreement with this, consistent with the average across all segments. But the disengaged traditionalists, as another group that might be considered vulnerable, but generally don't see themselves as such, tend to agree more with the sort of much more financially stable backbone conservatives. And it could be that these kinds of statements about using public money or using taxation to help vulnerable groups are seen as handouts, and that might also play a role in the international context as well, with discussions about some countries doing more than others and reparations. And with international summits, well, there's a risk of COP26 being seen as a thing for politicians and for advocates only. And the question here is how to connect COP26 to people's daily lives. How do we build a sense of ownership and involvement with COP26? And part of this might be learning what it is that people think of the event of COP26, of these terms like net zero and 1.5 degrees. What does it mean for them? And this quote from a disengaged battler from one of our focus groups suggests that maybe there's not such widespread understanding of what global conferences are for and how this connects to tangible action. So this quote says, people have these huge meetings, the G8 or G whatever, trying to discuss the whole business of global warming. But until someone actually takes the first step and says, this is what we're going to do, and it goes on. So the question, I guess, is then how do we make this connection between the abstract, between these events that people don't have very clear insight into, they don't see into, with everyday life and what that means for people in the UK. And we did ask related questions. So for instance, we asked a question about support for green recovery after COVID-19, and there is support across the board. And we asked this at 2 time points last year in May and September, and we see that support for green recovery is increasing across most of the segments. So if you look across progressive activists, civic pragmatists, established liberals, and also backbone conservatives, you see that agreement has actually increased. Where we don't see increases, particularly for disengaged battlers and disengaged traditionalists. And what's important is to look at their neither responses, which are quite huge for these two segments, indicating that particularly for the disengaged segments, there's a lot of uncertainty and sort of unknowns around what this actually means for them. And a similar question about green jobs shows the same sort of pattern. This question is about the government should tackle pollution and climate change in the UK's recovery because it's one of the best ways to create new jobs and boost the economy. And while we see the progressive activists are very strong in their agreement to this statement, there's potentially a lot more division between these other three segments here, the disengaged battlers, disengaged traditionalists, and backbone conservatives, indicating that there's perhaps uncertainty about whether this is the case, what it would mean for them, and how it would positively impact their lives. Now, a key challenge for COP26 is also online engagement and reaching across segments. And what our research suggests is that at the moment there aren't a whole lot of people that are very well trusted by all segments. And there is ongoing work on this. What we see is that, for instance, school strikers are not well trusted by many of the segments, particularly the older, more conservative-leaning segments, have not very much trust at all. And this is a scale from not at all to completely trust. And these are averages across all of the segments. And what we see for the environmental charities is this is one of the most trusted groups that we tested, but even so, scores are around the middle point for environmental charities. So there is work to be done in finding who it is that people trust to deliver these messages. And in terms of sort of online engagement and communication, this striking figure shows that progressive activists are by far the most dominant voice on social media when it comes to sharing news about politics. And as we've seen, progressive activists tend to have strong views on climate and take stances that often puts them at odds with the rest of the segments. So this figure actually shows that they're 6 times more likely to post about politics on social media than any other segment. So the question is, how do we make sure that we have broader engagement around this year's COP and to bring other segments on board as well? So finally, I'm going to finish up with some next steps that we are taking on this issue. That includes message testing to find ambitious and unifying frames that work across segments, to learn more about the public's understanding of COP26 and how we can increase the sense of connection and participation with the issue, as well as finding the right channels and messengers, and hopefully also finding a message that works globally. So I will leave it there and pass back to Dave. Thank you all very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Susie. So do keep the questions coming in the Q&A tab. If you could put questions in there, not in the chat, that means we won't lose them. And Susie will answer some, I'm sure, during the course of the next presentation. And we'll try and come back to the ones we don't answer at the end. So Robin, are you Are you good to go?
Yes, good to go.
Satisfactory sharing, very good. Yes, I shall hand
I'm
over
just going
to
to share my screen.
Very good. I'll hand it to Robin, who is a Senior Programme Lead for Advocacy Communications at Climate Outreach. Robin, over to you.
Great. Hey everybody, and hoping that my screen's going to come up. Brilliant. So as mentioned by Dave and Susie, I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between day-to-day lives and these sort of wider systemic changes, particularly how that relates to these big moments of climate change action, particularly around the COP, and sort of making those links as advocates. And I think it's worth starting by saying that this has been a quite a controversial issue really in the climate change conversation, and people have argued that talking about individual action, particularly, and the sort of pressure on us as individuals to make changes in our lives, is essentially kind of like a distraction from what the need to push for wider systemic change, to put pressure on polluters, to put pressure on governments to make bigger change. And it's even been kind of argued as a distracting tactic, that we shouldn't be thinking about it. So this is some of the context in which some of this conversation falls. And then, of course, at the other end of the scale, we get moments like this amazing event that's taken place in the UK at the end of this year. And it can be really difficult to kind of think about how you can make the link between a lot of people in a room talking about negotiations and all the sort of bullet points and technicalities and full stops that come with that, and kind of speeches by politicians. What does that actually mean for thinking about people's day-to-day lives and for helping people to think about climate change as an issue that they engage with? So I want to talk a little bit about what the social science of climate change engagement, drawn from a number of sources, shows us about how we can think about that. And two key sources that I'm using is that Climate Outreach contributed to the UNEP emissions gap report. We lead wrote a chapter with a number of other colleagues towards the end of last year. So that chapter is online. And also the other report I've highlighted here is one called Mainstreaming Low Carbon Lifestyles. Again, this is summarising the work of others from a 5-year project from Cardiff University years ago. So these are two kind of really key sources, but we've also got a number of other reports. We did a report on climate change communication in the time of COVID last year. We had another one coming up. Also, our theory of change reflects quite a lot of the ideas here. So there are other places for you to go and to look. And as mentioned, we have today published a briefing in which we are sort of pulling all these ideas together, and you'll get access to that. And that is available on our website. So this is a diagram, and I apologise for showing a complicated diagram, but it's actually one that I really like. And I think to sort of help think about, I guess, the different ways that social change happens. And this kind of deficit model that's illustrated on the left illustrates a conception of kind of how information flows and how change happens, where you have kind of experts at the top of the tree kind of providing information to everybody else, and we just kind of absorb it, and that's how kind of people learn to sort of learn more. And that sometimes our society kind of seems to reflect that understanding of society. But of course, we know as people that that's not really how it works in reality, and that as members of society we contribute to social intelligence, and that there's a relationship between conversations going on at the policy level, at governments. Governments are influenced by the conversations they see happening at the social level, by the changes they see happening. Think, for example, about the changes we saw on kind of attitudes to plastics a few years ago, and you can see how those big social changes can also start to change wider social conversations, how trade and industry and corporations and react, and experts feeding into that. So there's an interrelationship there, and those arrows going in all sorts of different directions. And I think thinking about this diagram often helps me to sort of see it in that wider context, and actually to feel more empowered as an individual. So I want to kind of actually sort of look at some of those different arrows going in different directions and think about what they mean. So the first one I'm highlighting is this idea that as individuals, we actually play a crucial part in wider social and system change. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, thinking about, so if there are actions that we may take as an individual. So for example, as an individual, you might decide to adopt a plant-based diet, more radically putting solar panels on the house, adopting different sorts of transport. And what we see is that as people, we are really profoundly influenced by the behavior of the people around us, and particularly by people that we see as our peers, that we see as kind of people like us. And there are kind of examples in the literature of one person in a neighborhood, you know, putting solar panels on their house, and that kind of acting as a catalyst. And suddenly you start to see lots and lots of other people doing the same thing. The same thing with adopting plant-based diets, the same thing with adopting things like electric cars. Like, the role of one person is not just about their individual behavior, it's about what they mean to the people around them. And these kind of social and cultural norms within which we work and live do change very slowly, you know, and we often kind of default to sort of back to the habits that we were adopting before. Habits are difficult to change and they take quite a long time to change. But once habits have changed, you can see new habits start to form, and that kind of can sort of start to lock in new lifestyles. And interestingly, on a social level, what you can see is that a committed minority of people, so a small number of people making change in lives, which is kind of visible, can actually comprise a sort of critical mass, and they start to form a social tipping point at which suddenly everybody else starts to do the same thing. And it can be quite difficult to work out when that tipping point is going to come. It can be quite unpredictable, but this is the kind of interesting way in which these changes start to happen. And then you think, well, what does this mean for governments? What does it mean for policy? Well, for good or for bad, in the particularly in democratic systems, we know that we may call on we need our politicians to be leaders, but they also need evidence of social consent from societies to introduce the kind of radical policy changes that we know are needed in response to the challenge of climate change. And if you think, some governments have prime ministers have fallen as a result of bringing in low carbon, bringing in climate change policy. So politicians are wary about introducing policy change if they feel it's going to be rejected by the electorate, if it's going to be, or if it's even just going to be ignored by the electorate, however good an idea it is. So, and I think an interesting example of this kind of change. So the smoking ban, it can often be kind of used as an example of a kind of government introducing a policy that we saw changing people's lives and social norms very, very quickly. But actually, if you dig into the reality of what happened to social change around smoking, it's a lot more complicated than government just introducing policy. We started to see increased public conversation, changes in public attitudes as a result of people campaigning, and changing in social norms, different attitudes on the day-to-day level to smoking. And also, crucially, this idea, I'm certainly old enough to remember this, that like the idea of passive smoking started to become a powerful force in society. And this idea that you stop smoking, not just for yourself, but for the people around you, sort of transcending self-interest, thinking about your actions in the wider community. And this opened up spaces for changes in taxation, for example, changes in the rules around advertising around smoking. So you get these smaller changes, eventually enough of build up that government introduced the big policy change, and then you see a really radical change happening at the social level. So there's that interaction. And I'll talk about this a bit more later, but I think we've seen very similar things. And interesting, the example of how behaviours have changed around COVID has also shown quite a lot of these dynamics. So in summary, the actions we take as an individual do matter. And I have to say, as an individual, and when I'm talking to people about climate change, I often find this, quite an inspiring concept, that actually it doesn't just matter for me, it changes the behaviour of the people around me, it matters for the people around me, and ultimately it matters for thinking about that wider system and policy change. Next part of the story, particularly when we're thinking about COP, government's talking about limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C by the end of the century. What does that actually mean? It's a big dynamic and a big conversation around climate change and around the COP. Well, it means lifestyle change. It really does. It means changes to day-to-day lives. And I think what we've seen is that we've seen massive changes with sort of, for example, energy systems. But energy systems can feel quite distant from people's lives. But actually limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C means changes on the range of these totemic issues: diet, personal travel, home heating. And that's because at a global level, 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions are connected to people's lives, are connected to households. Now, this is a more complex story than just us being able to voluntarily change 2/3 of our emissions, but it does show how important that part of the story really is in making that change. And affluent households on a global level are particularly important in making this change. So the upper 10% globally of household incomes use around 45% and 75% of the energy associated with transport and aviation. So you can see that massive inequity there. You can see that massive need for those households to change their behaviour in order to create the kind of change that we need. And that 10% is not just, the people with the private jets. It's a significant portion of the UK population. It's probably an income of around about $40,000. So it's certainly not everybody in this country, but it's not just billionaires. It's talking about quite a big proportion of our population here. And as you can see, if you actually do talk about the richest 1%, the 1.5 degrees C target means emissions per capita reducing by 30 times, whereas the poorest can increase by 3 times. So you can see how affluent households that we may be communicating with, need to make a major contribution. So in summary, emissions reductions from the energy system, where we've seen really major and radical changes, can feel distant from people's lives. We're now at a stage, this 1.5 degrees C target, which is a huge part of the COP conversation, is about making deeper cuts to emissions, about day-to-day lives, the things that affect us on a day-to-day level, and particularly for those on higher incomes. So that is a kind of unavoidable fact of the kind of change we're talking about right now. Thinking again about those arrows, about the role of government in driving change. So of course, it would be deeply kind of inaccurate, and I think a genuine reflection of those critiques about it just making us feel guilty, if you don't think about the role of government in this, because actually government lifestyles may account for 2/3 of emissions, but those emissions are connected to our physical environment, the cultural conventions around us, is it normal to get in the car or not, social norms, the financial and policy frameworks, what's affordable, and of course, crucially, people's income levels, their access to resources to make change. You might theoretically be able to, but if you don't have access to the financial, the emotional, the structural resources to make those changes, they're not going to happen. And an interesting example of this is like 3 billion people around the world rely on solid fuels for household heating, and changing that energy source to different sources of energy and electricity would make a massive difference, both to development indicators, to people's health, and also to emissions. But they need the infrastructure, they need the resources to make that change. And of course that comes from. And I think COVID-19 has shown us a really interesting example of what this kind of change can look like in practice and at speed. And so rather not predicted by anybody, but what we saw a year ago and over the last year is these rapid, extensive and profound changes in lifestyle. And those changes were driven by those arrows going in different directions, by people understanding the threat and the changing social norms around there, but also the role government plays a crucial role, and you've seen that in different countries around the world, in changing those social norms and introducing a sense of collective agency that you as a person in your day-to-day life can make a difference by choosing to wear a mask in a shop, for example. And that's something which isn't just, again, about yourself, it's something you're doing for the wider community, but also government providing the resources, the infrastructure to lock in those behaviours and to mean that people are able to commit to them. And that ultimately we've seen some changes, like changes to cycling habits and infrastructure as a result of lockdowns. Governments can choose to lock in those behaviours longer term. So we do see from polls that people are willing to make the changes, and there's some interesting breakdown which I'm not going to hear on the different reflections on people's willingness to make the smaller and larger changes according to those Britain Talks climate segments. But you do see quite large numbers of people, up to 60 to 70%, saying they're willing to make kind of changes like giving up some meat in their diet, or thinking that we should fly less. So people are able to make that changes, but we need governments to create the conditions under which those lifestyle changes are possible. So again, coming back to messaging around COP, this is the moment governments make those commitments and they enable us, they give us the power as people to make those changes. So that's one of the reasons why COP is such a crucial moment, because you make that collective commitment at an international level that then filters down to the collective behaviour of everybody at an individual and neighbourhood and civic level. Finally, and thinking about us as advocates who care about giving people the power and the ability to make change and to push for making change. So I think there's been quite a lot of debate in this conversation around the relationship between, does it matter if somebody's kind of pushing themselves to make individual change and pushing others, but what does that mean for kind of advocacy? Well, I should highlight, this is this is again from that Cardiff University report. It is from 2017, so the data's a little bit older, but you can see here that people generally are more willing and have said that they do kind of lower level type activities, turning off lights, recycling, turning off the tap, etc. Like these are a big part of people's lives across society, and the more radical behaviours, flying, avoiding eating meat, are less frequently expressed across behaviours. So that pattern is seen. I think it's really interesting, and I really like this quote from some recent research that we did into young people's responses to climate action, is that saying young people, and you may see young people trying in response to the challenge of climate change to change their own individual behaviour and perhaps change the behaviour, of the people in their family around them. But when those young people are actually asked about why they're doing that, it's not necessarily because they think that's the only thing they should do. It's because they don't feel like they have the power to do anything else. So they lack the power to engage in collective social actions, which they believe are really necessary. So if they had the power, the knowledge, the ability to do something bigger, they might do it, but they do what is within their reach. So I think that can sometimes put a different spin on thinking about these individual changes. What the research and what this Cardiff University report showed is that if fewer people adopt these larger behaviours, I'm not just talking about the sort of big lifestyle behaviours, but also perhaps, in being willing to engage in environmental protest, etc. If people do adopt more impactful behaviours, they're more likely afterwards to talk about it to other people and to adopt other significant behaviours. And this is because doing a small thing is less likely to kind of affect your sense of identity, who you are. But if you think, okay, well, I'm now somebody who's gone to a protest, that's something that's become a part of me, and I'm going to talk to other people about that, I'm going to start doing other things. So this idea of behaviour spilling over from one thing into another, it's much more likely to happen when behaviours are based on free choice, people's free choice, their internal understanding of the world. They're reacting to the things that they think is the right thing to do, and then doing something, and then a change of identity, and then that's more likely to spill over into other behaviours. And looking at it from the other direction, but as human beings, a lot of research across the board shows that people tend to really dislike hypocrisy. And I'm sure as climate change advocates, you've probably all encountered some of these conversations about, you can't be a climate advocate if you choose to drive your car or whatever. Like, people are very sensitive to hypocrisy and to authenticity. So if climate advocates are taking individual behaviour in their day-to-day lives, it does mean they're more convincing to other people when they're starting to talk about wider and system change, because they're seen as authentic, they're seen as acting in line with their kind of beliefs and behaviours. So to sort of summarise that, the sort of journey from taking action as an individual to taking action on a wider change, citizens who undertake personal lifestyle change may be willing to move towards advocating for wider system change, for example, for thinking about influence of COP and thinking about how they can influence governments. If they're given that support and context, sense of empowerment, sense of acting with others, they're given that opportunity to do that. And also, but sort of looking at it from the flip side, if they're already doing those kind of individual day-to-day behaviours, then they're always seen as more convincing as a climate activist. They seem to be acting in line with their beliefs and values. So again, I think that means if you're communicating with people as a climate advocate, then you can, it kind of shows the validity of doing those individual behaviours, that they are a part of a bigger picture. We're now going on to the question section. That's the end of my presentation. So I think I will stop sharing, if that's correct. Yeah, go on to the next stage.
Fantastic, Robin, thank you so much for that, and Susie as well for your fascinating presentations. I've just put a link in the chat, hopefully everyone can see, to the briefing that underpinned what Robin was talking about. I'm going to give Robin a little bit of a break and ask Susie and maybe Jamie if he wants to come in as well. A question that's been put in the question and answer box from Cass Hebron about experts. So Cass says there's been a problem in recent years with skepticism of expert opinions. Based on the studies that we have done, is this still a prevalent view in British society, or are we seeing more trust in experts again? Do we feel we can say anything about that?
I can maybe speak to some of the things that we found in the Britain Talks climate data. I think one of the things that I didn't show was the range of groups that we asked about and how much people trusted them. And I think that one of the most trusted groups across most of the segments was actually climate scientists, which does indicate that they are, more trusted than other people when it comes to climate change. But of course, then I think there's a difference between asking people if you would hypothetically trust a climate scientist about climate change and actually presenting them with a message and seeing if they believe it, if it's maybe challenging other things that they believe. So there's definitely a lot more work to be done there. I'd also be curious to know if anyone knows of any research recently about the impact of COVID and experts on people's opinions with regard to expertise.
I'll quickly follow that up. I mean, the research I've seen recently suggests that COVID has raised people's trust in science quite considerably, and it was already at a very high level. I think it's also beginning to point to social science as important, because we are hearing much more about from behavioural scientists. But as Susie says, yeah, trust and understanding in reality are often translated through people's values. So if they can relate to those scientists, and those scientists are speaking and acting in a way that is relatable to those communities, that's key. And at Climate Outreach, we actually have a program dedicated to working with climate scientists to support them to more effectively engage wider audiences. They're experts in their subjects, but providing them with the support to be able to relay that outside of their academic circles is one of our key roles. And we're working on an ambassador program with a range of climate scientists from across the globe in the run up to COP26 to actually try and drive that forward.
Thanks, Jamie. Robin, I'm going to come to you with a couple of related questions. You've had your break now. You asked some questions. So first question was from Harriet, who was interested in your diagram of how social change happens. And she wonders whether or not civil society should be included in the graphic about how social change happens. Where does civil society fit into that dialogue model? Mm-hmm. And then I'll also ask whether a question from Susanna, who asks, do you think that the COP itself process needs to change to embody that dialogue model? So I'll ask that to Robin first, and if anyone else wants to come in, please feel free.
Oh, my brain's just gone blank at what the first question was. I'm really sorry.
Civil society. How does civil society fit into that?
Yes, I think that's a really good point and a really interesting one. Actually, that diagram comes from a paper on sort of social change in response to, I think it's a paper from a biology journal. So, and it's something that I've been thinking it would be great to create our own climate outreach version of it, because then we can kind of really think in detail about all those different parts of the equation and how they fit together. And I think absolutely yes. I mean, civil society is the missing gap there, and it's really interesting to see kind of where civil society sits there, because it's about, I'm sure we've got people on this call who are working at the level of communicating about change, people at all levels, at levels of sort of neighbourhood level. But then you also have climate advocates who are thinking very solely about how you influence government policy. And sometimes it can be difficult as civil society advocates to draw those, they become a little bit never the twain shall meet, and you're just what you influence policy, and others are thinking about how you influence kind of the day-to-day behaviour. And that's, for me, one of the reasons why this kind of work is so interesting, because I think it's thinking about how we can create messaging that links those two stories together and helps them feel like they're part of the same thing, which they so truly are. So good suggestion, and yeah, I think we should do it. Yeah, I mean, Jamie may well have views on this. I think I absolutely agree. And it's quite interesting to see what's happening with the conversation around this upcoming COP. We've had previous COPs where, for good or for bad, it's been quite clear what we want out of this moment. So like the Paris Climate Change Conference in 2015 is quite a famous moment, and the 2009 Copenhagen Conference is a famous moment for a less good reason. But in both cases, we knew, and climate advocates very clearly knew sort of what was wanted in terms of public terms, and thinking about, like, you know, this is a moment where we want to sign the deal kind of conversation. As the COP itself is more about sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's and making sure that governments have made their national commitments right now. And that can be trickier for climate advocates because you've got a bit less of a kind of one thing to point at and go, you know, this is what we're all calling for right now. And I think that pressure is also it's on our government as a host as well for the conference, to sort of create a really clear sense of clarity about what's needed and the drivers there, and also somehow opening up that space for the public conversation, which I think is governments have not fulfilled their commitments on this, and under the UNFCCC and the COP process, they actually are required to, and we're about to start some work where we're going to be thinking about this more in depth and calling on governments to do this at a wider level. Jamie, I don't know if you want to pick up any of that, probably talk too much anyway, but.
No, I'm happy to keep going because we've got a lot of questions, I think.
Certainly do. So I'm going to ask a question for Susie that has come from, I've lost it, one of the most recent ones, where is it? It's a question about, from Claire Shorter, about different types of media. So Susie, you highlighted social media is heavily used by progressive activists. What does that mean about reaching other segments with different sorts of media? And yeah, Claire's asking what the implications of that are for anyone who isn't a progressive activist.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Claire, for the question. I think so. Actually, what was shown in that slide is not that progressive activists are more likely to use social media. It's more that they're more likely to post about politics on social media. So they're the ones that are talking about these things on social media. But what we do see is that across the segments, there's a lot of variation in the platforms that people will use. So I think Facebook is one of the ones that's quite universal across segments, particularly higher for segments like the Loyal Nationals, Backbone Conservatives, and so on. Twitter tends to be more progressive activists. So you do see trends like that. And there are potential ways of identifying how to reach people by looking at those kinds of things. And we also did a news media analysis and found that things like platforms like BBC and ITV were relatively watched across many segments, whereas some other news sources like The Guardian were sort of more towards one end of the spectrum than the other. I hope that answered your question.
Thanks very much. I'll push on. I'm going to ask a question from Lucy Galvin. I guess this is first to Robin, but then Jamie might have a view as well. So Lucy says, is it not the case that the scale and pace of change we need can only really be achieved by policy and funding? And there are various problems around with people taking small actions that then reward themselves with other behaviours that are ultimately worse. So I think two different questions. So asking the extent to which I think it's a question about the extent to which individual action will actually change things.
Yeah, and I think this is the crux of the conversation in many ways. And it has caused some advocates to argue that, you know, don't think about your personal life because we need such a massive change. That, you know, in a sense, it's kind of not worth it. I have sympathy for that feeling, but I just don't think it reflects how we function as people. Like, as I sort of argued, that it has to be down to those big, huge system change and government introducing that. But we can see the reality of it is that governments are not going to move into that place unless they feel that pressure from society. And that society comes not just from like boots on the ground and public protest, that is a part of the story, but from what the conversations that politicians have in the pub, if we ever get back to the pub, you know, like the reality of the world in which we're living. And that is a part of kind of what you see, whether you go out the door and you see the world looking any different from how it looked 5 years ago. That's part of the driver for that process. I think what you're talking about, kind of people rewarding themselves. Yeah, there's a thing called I forget the term, is the bounce back effect, where someone, you know, basically feels they've got permission to go and do something else once they've done something good. I think for me, this comes back to that story about kind of authenticity and identity. So like you won't kind of reward yourself for recycling by flying to Hawaii if you know it's become a big part of your identity of kind of understanding that fuller story and kind of acting with authenticity across it.
Happy to just chip in. So on the need for policy and funding, yes, that's going to be at the heart of transforming our society, is having the right policies in place and the funding to make them happen. But I suppose Climate Outreach's perspective is that for 20 years we've been very much focused on that, and we've made some really great inroads. But ultimately, the public and wider society is fundamental to driving both policy and funding and behaviour elements, and that's why we put it at the centre of the picture for what's needed in tackling and addressing climate change in the run up to COP26 and further, and making sure that that human dimension is seen and recognised. I mean, it's interesting that organisations like the Climate Change Committee, who are now making recommendations for this country and how we achieve net zero as legally required, have moved to recognise the key centrality of society and behaviour change and the attitudes and perspectives of individuals and populations as part of that. I think in their recent paper on how the UK addresses it, the public and public engagement was quoted more than 100 times, and in previous papers there was no mention of it. So, you know, from a policy perspective they understand this, and from a corporate perspective also. So the public are critical, and I think just to follow up on the individual behaviour change versus system change sort of dilemma that often comes up, the two are two sides of the same coin. I think we've often said, because for the public, they will often question the authenticity of someone espousing a low carbon lifestyle for others whilst having an extremely high one themselves. So there's an authentic messenger there, but also that recognition of the need to create social norms about what is acceptable and what people want, and then politicians are more likely to feel enabled to do that. So the two are together, and I don't think that dichotomy is that, and seeing them as binary is that helpful. I think we need to get to a maturer place of understanding, but clearly we don't want to continue with this idea of just focusing on small personal actions then alone, without that wider understanding of the bigger issue that we have of climate change. So that we've seen traditionally people may think they get a green halo from doing the recycling, and then it allows them to do far more carbon polluting activities.
Thanks, Jamie. So I've just had the nudge from Francis. This will be the last question, and so sorry we haven't remotely answered all of these questions, but do get in touch with us, and I'm sure we can happily answer questions afterwards. The question I wanted to ask is for Robin and Susie, who might have different lenses on this, which is about COVID, and it's from Siobhan. And Siobhan says, Robin mentioned this year showed the scale of what we can do with behaviour change, but is there something distinct about having done it in lockdowns? And once we're weary of lockdown and we're getting back to normal, will people just jump on a plane and go on holiday, or how do we lock in the benefits of the last year? So if you could say something on that, and then I'll just end the session. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and there's been a lot of interesting dynamics around it. I mean, I think obviously it has been a very unprecedented, where we used a lot recently, situation, and to see that kind of radical change happen, it has, as a climate advocate, in some ways the conversation around it, what we saw happening, did feel like the conversation I'd seen happen on climate change for the previous 15-20 years kind of speeded up. And I think it has shown people, and as polls show, particularly polls taken last spring, you know, when in our kind of first peak of it, people's greater understanding of the idea of collective agency, and that comes through some of the Britain Talks climate polling, and that, like, you know, that people will help each other. And I think that is a really crucial and core part of the story. The question about do we kind of fall back into previous behaviours, yeah, is a really interesting one. I think people have been surprised that concern about climate change hasn't been bumped by as much as you might have projected by concern about COVID. And there's some research out there which shows that it's a bit suggestive, but that, you know, habits potentially take about 12 weeks to form. And obviously we kind of had lockdowns in which people had a chance to kind of slightly longer term change their behaviours. And that means you kind of fall into a new default, which means it is possible. But again, it comes back to that infrastructure, that context, like what messages are you getting from your neighbours, from your job, from your government? Those are all the core things then that determine whether people stick with those habits or fall back to where they were before.
I completely agree with Robin. I don't know if we're out of time. Just wanted to add that there's quite a bit of research on what's called moments of change. So in periods of disruption, whether you're moving house or changing, going through a transition in your life or going through a pandemic, people tend to change their habits and behaviors, and that can be an intervention point. So not only for individuals to change what they're doing, but also for governments, for policymakers, for instance, cities that change the infrastructure of cities, the layout of cities to encourage more active travel, for instance, means that when people come out of the lockdown, they're more likely to engage in different kinds of behaviors because the availability of what's around them has changed. That's also, yeah, what I wanted to say.
Superb. We're out of time. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, panelists, for panelising. Thank you, guests, for your questions, your participation. Thank you very much. Do get in touch with us. Do subscribe to our newsletter if you'd like to be kept up to date with the latest. And yes, thank you again.